Hello and welcome to Dialogue. After 3 years of no outdoor concerts, the Midi Music Festival returns, allowing Chinese rock and roll fans to once again see their favorite bands perform. And beginning March 15th, China will resume issuing all types of visas for foreigners to enter the country. China will also resume outbound group tours to another 40 countries. With all these moves, is COVID-19 finally over in China? Has China's fight against the pandemic been successful? And we'll also look at why Washington continues to push the lab leak theory in the origins of COVID. To help us look at these issues, I'm joined today by Anna Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Zoom Ahmed Khan, research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Professor Ma Liang with the School of Public Administration and Policy at Renmin University of China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Starting from March 15th, China resumes issuing all types of visas. Foreigners with visas that were issued before March 28th, 2020 and are still valid will be allowed to enter the country, and visa-free policies will be resumed for entry to the southern island province of Hainan and cruise tour groups at the Shanghai ports. So Anna Tangen, I will start with you. What's the message from such a move?
Well, clearly China is open for business. I mean, tourism is not only very big for China, but it's also a huge issue, especially for ASEAN countries who have in the past gained significant revenue from this. And they're really looking forward to it. Right now, everybody is scrambling, airlines, hotels, etc., to kind of bulk up, get the amount of staff that they need in order to take care of their people. But this is a very, very welcome respite.
Zoon, what does this mean for travel and business probably in China and around the world?
Well, firstly, thank you, Qinduo, for having me. I completely resonate with Anar's comments. For many countries, the ASEAN countries, even European countries, Chinese tourists brought an incredible opportunity. It was also a very important way to engage. It was an important way for the world and China to connect on a human level. And the Chinese, surging middle class, the Chinese upper middle class, offers that valuable opportunity to the global tourism industry. So, of course, first of all, it's a very welcome development. It's bringing a human interaction much closer. It's also speaking volumes about China's fight against COVID-19, that within a few months, we see that surge of activity. We see that surge of activity, both inbound and outbound, picking up pace. And we see that businesses are resuming as usual. And you mentioned a few festivals as well. That festival is an example of what's happening all over the country. People are, spending holidays also within different parts of China and planning to go overseas. We see this in also the number of new passports issued, the number of people coming to China as well. And I'll also add that, for us, in think tanks, in universities, this is a very welcome development. We see the number of scholars, the number of people still not only interested, but enthusiastic to come back to China, some of them after over 3 years.
Ma Liang, we see, just as Zoom mentioned, live music fans can finally enjoy concerts outdoors, with the Midi Music Festival this year playing in Hainan. And it was also recently announced that students and teachers are no longer required to wear masks on campuses. With these moves, so can we say, finally, COVID-19, the pandemic, is completely over in China?
I think if we are going to see the over of the COVID-19 pandemic in China and the whole world, because we can see that with the reopening of the border of China and many other countries, people are moving around. And also we can see that a lot of the previous pandemic control policies have been relaxed and to some extent have been stopped. So I think we can see some strong signal that the pandemic is over. But given the uncertainty and the complexity of the pandemic, we have to still keep alert that we have to make sure that if we can get prepared as long as there are some kinds of waves in the near future. So generally speaking, we can say that it's quite safe to say that the pandemic is almost over. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of work, probably that's people would expect that's the end. Of course, when it comes to the virus itself, it's still there, and we will take a closer look at that later on. But Anna, it took China less than 2 months to downgrade its management of the disease from class A to B. I think that's an outcome much better than many expected, right? We know that at that time a lot of people were expecting basically a return or a new wave of a pandemic, basically a new wave of infection, something more serious could come because of the opening. But no, it's over basically.
Yeah, I mean, go back 3 months, everyone was forecasting that there'd be, these a second and then maybe even larger third wave, especially after the Spring Festival. But it never materialized. What happened is it seemed to go through China very, very quickly. And that's not to minimize the people who were affected by this and who died. I'm just saying that because China delayed its opening up, it was able to save a tremendous number of lives versus other countries. And we're going to see that, towards the end of this year, there'll be that ability to take a look at excess deaths, not only in China, but around the world over this last 3.5-year period. And when that happens, I think it's going to be it'll be a revelation exactly which countries were able to handle it and which ones weren't. And this is important, not because China wants to declare victory, but this is going to be the key to future pandemics, because there will be others. I've talked to people at the WHO, and they just assure you it's not if, it's just a question of when. And the issue is, how do you prepare for this so that we don't go through the same kind of confusion that we had last time, where politics rather than science took the upper hand?
Well, we'll also talk about that. That's something beyond China, something about the global response or preparation, for something like this in the future. But Zoon, when it comes to people, as someone who is from another country who live in China for the past 3 years during the pandemic, what's your experience? I mean, how challenging is it? And what's your sense about being safe or being unsafe in terms of the virus or infection?
Chindo, there's so much to unpack on this. One of the things I started doing when initially China was considered the hotspot, initially when the cases broke out in Wuhan, was to try as best as I could become one of the many voices coming out of China to global media to help them understand we over here are feeling safe. What China is doing is indeed setting a precedent for countries to deal with the extraordinary situation that has obviously, come about. And it's a global challenge in that sense. So over these years, I mean, if I also in retrospect look at some of the unfortunate phases that many countries, including my own, went through, for example, the Delta variant, the way it was a self-help situation for many, and so many lives in the process were lost. Many frontliners, share their stories in other parts of the world where they felt as if there's a lack of control or a lack of prioritization of how to contain the situation. And in China, we saw that consistently. Not only was there a sensible way of, a country level policy to manage resources on a nationwide level, to do smart lockdowns where required, and to absolutely ensure that people felt safe. This set an example for many countries across the world. And of course, we know that in 2022, the variant was much more contagious. The extent of, people having to stay home increased. But at no point did people feel unsafe. At no point did people feel that, they're on their own and they have to deal with this on their own. And of course, I mean, the way China has opened up, the way China has, moved past the zero COVID policy also took months of planning, which is why we see that within 2 months, things are back in motion. And today we are talking about not having to wear masks in schools, not having to worry about falling sick, and seeing that people are traveling a lot inbound and outbound. So I obviously felt safe, but I saw that, of course, like Einar mentions, China has set an example for the world. And I see that there are countries across, especially developing countries, that learned a lot throughout these 3 years from China's policies and from the way China has managed this challenge indeed.
Continue, please. You mentioned about other countries see strength or see points in China's practice. Probably they think, oh, that's meaningful. We can, we can
Yes.
borrow, we can learn. If there's something like this in the future, we can probably also do that. Tell us more about that.
For example, Chindu, in the beginning in 2020, China was the country that was sending enormous numbers of teams because at that time, China was the country where frontliners had an experience dealing with COVID-19. And there were doctors, there were experienced medical professionals, practitioners in countries like Pakistan, in many African countries, South Asian countries that didn't know how to deal with the situation. And the cases were spreading, of course. So at that point, China sent teams, trained them. China's policy of, for example, if there was an outbreak in a city like Beijing or elsewhere, they followed a smart lockdown policy and then observed for the next 2 weeks. This is something that my own country also learned immensely from. And then what kind of precautions do we need to take? So what many countries at that point, especially developing countries, pointed out was that in China's case, they are able to, with limited resources compared to some of the most developed countries in the world, it's much better for us to follow China's example, which is a prevention-oriented policy. And that was something which we saw throughout 2020 and 2021, helping countries, especially in the beginning, deal with prevention as a policy and also to manage. So one difference was, for instance, that in China, we were able to do testing at a scale that many developing countries can't afford. So to replace that, they started doing smart testing, which is basically you take a sample size and through that you decipher which are the hotspots currently. And then you do relative, lockdowns, you observe that and try your best to curb the spread of the virus. So of course, there was a lot of coordination between medical staff, between technical teams, and then, of course, the vaccines. It was Chinese vaccines going to so many countries at a point when it was also not so affordable. China also opened factories, helping countries outside of China to develop their own vaccines so that they can meet the domestic requirement. And the most important was obviously right in the beginning, right at the onset, when these medical teams went to dozens of countries to help them, to train them, to build the capacity, how to treat COVID and how to prevent its spread.
Well, Malian, obviously, you spend most of the time inside China, in particular over the past 3 years. What's your observation, you're looking at the efforts and the policies and the practice by the Chinese governments at different levels in response to, outbreaks, including the beginning, and then you see small outbreaks in different places, and then you need to probably require different response.
Yeah, actually, if we look at the past 3 years, China has been quite successful in responding to the pandemic because China's strategies is quite consistent and persistent. It means that in the early responses to the pandemic, we know that the virus was quite strong and dangerous. Our strategy was mainly to prevent people from confirmation or deaths, which is quite successful. And actually, we are among the earliest to recovery and to make the economy go back to the norm. And in the later on stage of the pandemic control, we can see that the government is going to make very swift and strong change of the policies to make sure that we can really go back to the norm, because we know that in the later stage, the variations of the virus get to be very weak and very friendly to some extent, so that it means that it's the right time to consider reopen and to consider how to swiftly change the whole policy.
But if you look at it globally, what lessons or what experience we have, probably in preparation for something like this in the future?
Well, it really comes down to putting science above politics, and there has to be a plan. I mean, the WHO actually had a plan ahead for pandemic. It had been completed literally 2 months before. the pandemic actually broke out. So they were in a better position to try to do that. But getting governments to understand that this is not politics. You can't put your economics above people's health, because in the end, if your economy won't work if everyone's sick, if the pandemic is running riot and people are dying. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned there. But even, despite China had the best in class response, but let's look at the lessons. Probably the next time there'd be more emphasis on vaccines above testing. There would probably better ways of dealing with people's frustrations in terms of letting them know, what the milestones are for this, what the government is actually looking for. So communication, action, all very, very important, but it has to be coordinated internationally. I mean, just imagine if the U.S., who can find $100 billion to support a war in Ukraine, had been willing to pony up a large share of the $50 billion that was necessary to vaccinate the entire world. That would have saved millions of lives. Yet, it wasn't done. Why? Political purposes, maybe some economic interests in terms of some of these vaccine makers and things like that.
Is that a priority issue?
It is a priority issue. I mean, come on, when you have a pandemic, you have to act, and you have to act swiftly. The quicker you act, all right, the more lives you save. If you have a uniform response to the pandemic based on not everyone shutting down, but saying, look, if you hit these milestones, you need to shut down. And everybody is doing that. They will do their part to contain it to the point where you can get vaccines out there and then have an effective response without losing so many lives. And remember, the countries that lost lives, like the United States, less than 4.2% of the world's population lost 16% of the world's, in terms of deaths from COVID that we know of. There'll be more from when they start calculating excess deaths. They didn't do well economically. So this idea that, just letting things happen, it'll all work out. Great Britain embraced that, then didn't embrace it, then re-embraced it, went up and down like a yo-yo. Didn't help their country, didn't help the economy, nor did it save lives. So hopefully, in the broad scheme of things, when people look at this afterwards, they will see very clearly what the lessons are, and they'll depoliticize this. Because this isn't about politics. Saving people's lives and responding to a pandemic is about science.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Einar mentioned is absolute. It's so profound, and it's a point that we need to think about. The countries that thought they are saving the economy by ignoring the spread of COVID in the beginning were the ones that ended up with indefinite lockdowns, a lack of control, a lack of ability to protect some of the most, vulnerable factions of their societies. And the result is the sheer death toll and a devastating consequence on the economy. In China's case, I remember in the beginning, there were a few weeks where largely, we were volunteering to stay at home. This is the period when obviously less was known about how dangerous the COVID-19 virus is. But it was literally, I remember March, April, that again you saw cars. I'm talking about 2020. So that initial cautious period resulted in a much quicker, movement, increase in activity, economic activity as well. You also look at China's economic performance throughout this period. I mean, from last year, for example, out of the G20 countries, China has the lowest inflation rate, and it has one of the lowest in the world. We see that, of course, like the professor also mentioned, there are points that need to be reflected on. And for the international audience watching this, they should also know that in China, there was a constant discussion and debate about the implementation of COVID policies, and there was constant need to improve further. So long story short, I think what I would like to emphasize here is that China did set an example, firstly, to prioritize the things that matter the most, which is saving lives, making sure people are safe. And as a consequence, the economy has fared much better in the countries that supposedly was saving the economy. And then the second point is that for China, how to deal with COVID-19, it's also about constant reflection, constant observation, constant ability to further improve. You can't just set a policy, it's set in stone, and then you say, okay, in every part of the country, something different was working better. And you have to observe, you have to be willing to reflect and upgrade. So there are a lot of examples, there are a lot of lessons for the world to learn. And I think in that sense, I'll also add that China's ability to deal with the situation in a way that many developed countries were not able to also enhance China's ability to help others. If you have the virus proliferated domestically and, God forbid, very high death tolls, you can't afford to send medical teams overseas. You can't afford to send masks in the millions to each country that needed them. And China's ability to manage the situation domestically also enhanced the capacity to be a source of stability, a source of, really helping countries that needed help at that point. So a lot needs to be learned, and I hope that we do put health over politics. And this is a realization, an increasing realization in what we call the 70% of the world, the developing countries.
Right. Malia, of course, we still remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the lack of global coordination. For example, the U.S. and the Trump administration basically withdrew from the World Health Organization. Of course, this does not help at all. The country returned later on under the Biden administration, but that's just one example to show that the lack of coordination. Probably next time around, hopefully countries should work together in a better manner.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that international coordination in terms of public health emergencies is quite important. China has been progressing over the past decade. We can say that during the time of SARS in 2003, we can say that there was not effective coordination in terms of responses globally. But in this round of COVID-19 pandemic control, we can say that the international coordination at the global level has been improved. First, we can say that the China government was quite transparent during the early outbreak of the pandemic. The China government and the scientists, they share all the information they have to the global community to let other countries and regions to be prepared early. And meanwhile, we can say that China is also playing very important global leadership role in helping many countries and regions to get prepared to respond to the pandemic. But taken together, we can say that the international coordination in terms of public health responses is not as strong as what we expect. In the future, we hope that there might be some kinds of mechanisms or frameworks that the majority of the countries can agree and support, so that there would be more effective alert and response system to help us to get prepared for the next round of outbreak of virus, like in many other similar cases. Yeah.
Well, earlier, Anna, you mentioned about politicization of the virus, politics. Let's say politics inside a country, politics, between countries. In particular, probably between China and the United States. Even today, we heard of a report, for example, from the U.S. Energy Department. A report concluded with, quote, low confidence that COVID-19 pandemic most likely arose from a laboratory leak. And then in the Congress, you have committees that talking about, tracing the origin. Many people are concerned. Again, politics is rising. Targeting China or scapegoating China.
Yeah, I mean, it's convenient. I mean, you have a committee at the House level that is devoted to identifying China as a threat and supporting it. They have a conclusion. Now they're just going to look for proof. Why bother having a trial when you can go straight to execution, right? In any event, it's turned into a kind of mob thing. It's laughable. The Energy Department is not exactly the first group that you'd be looking for. Now, Biden asked for a comprehensive, review of all of the studies by all the departments. And at the time, they came out and they said it's inconclusive. We believe that this was done through natural causes. We have no proof that it was done that it was a lab leak or anything like that. And then, afterwards, it's strange. After they've had a comprehensive review, the Energy Department a year later says, oh no, we have low confidence. Low confidence, and why are you even bringing this forward if there's already been a review? So yes, it's politics as usual. In the United States right now, everything is concerned about domestic politics, who can be tougher on China. This is an election issue that seems to be consuming it. Right now, you have a system where so many democracies, the people in them, are only concerned about the next election as opposed to the future of the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, in an ideal situation, I mean, we should leave the matter to the scientists from the US, from China, from WHO, from every country.
We say that, but it's never that simple, because the scientists come in, and it's easy. It's like, you remember Spokane. The Tobacco Institute used to say, well, who knows? They were scientists. We have scientists who say things. There are always going to be a few scientists who go outside the boundary. What you have to look to is the mainstream scientists, the ones who, a collective body of scientists who are respectable, who are saying, listen, this is what we need to do. But you don't want to be reacting. You have people who are drawing up plans now based on all the pain that we went through. And hopefully those will be the mechanisms. And unfortunately, you have to deal with the politics. There's always going to be politics, domestic situations between parties, candidates, everyone trying to differentiate themselves, some just appealing to whatever they think the people want. Yeah, of course, it'd be nice to say, oh, don't worry about COVID. Don't worry, everything will be fine, right? And people say, oh, well, he told me that, so I like him. I want to vote for him. But you can't do that. That's not the way viruses work. It is science. So one of the things that came out of both the CDC and the WHO is that there has to be a plan from, once the science is there, how to deal with the politics, how to explain to politicians, all right, how to present this to people so that you're not creating these factions, you're not creating counter currents that are going to interfere with actually dealing with the problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, related to the pandemic issue, of course, is people's lives, and if you look at that, the macro manner is national economies. Sometimes, if you look at the media in the West, they would present, the Chinese economy is growing at the lowest level in decades. But without comparison with other countries. But look at China in particular for 2023, for example, probably one of the brightest point in terms of growth.
Well, that's not a convenient fact. It's just like they announced that China had increased its military budget to 7.2%, which means that it increased by 0.1% because the previous year it was 7.1%. But they forgot to mention that Japan increased their military budget by 26%, that the US increased their budget by 11.7%. Now, 11.7% of the largest military budget in the world is a lot. They didn't mention that the US spends almost $90 billion a year just on spying, okay? Now, the whole PLA budget, People's Liberation Army of China, is $230 billion. So that gives you an order of magnitude. But this is the problem. The press is, especially in the West, is very hostile to China. And it's kind of reinforcing it. They talk about Xinjiang, they talk about COVID, everything bad, everything that China does is automatically bad. Even when China gets Iran and Saudi Arabia to exchange envoys, all right? Oh, China has an agenda. I mean, peace is an agenda. It's something we should fight against. Yes, agenda for peace. Very suspicious. Time to rethink this whole peace thing. Why? Well, China's proposing it. And this is the madness and the irony. But this lack of trust, which is at the base of everything, is not only destroying the ability of countries to work together, it's destroying the ability of people to trust their governments. And this is a poison that has to be gotten rid of. Otherwise, you can't have a society, you can't have relations with people, you can't do business, you can't have diplomacy unless there's some level of trust, and that needs to return.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.